Nintendo's one of, if not the most popular video game company of all time, thanks to all their excellent games and legendary roster of characters. But while that's all well and good, one thing that I don't think the above-average-sized den gets enough love for is their endless line of gimmicks. What's a gimmick in the world of gaming? Well, technically everything's a gimmick if you think about it, so it really depends on who you ask. But if you're asking me, then I'd describe them as basically any kind of enhancements to video games that could be considered weird, whether it be with the hardware, controller, or any other kind of extra accessories. Most video game companies and console makers have used gimmicks in the past, but none have ever come close to thinking outside of the box as often as Nintendo has, and I'm glad that they did, because even though they didn't necessarily invent all their gimmicks, they certainly popularized many of them, and if they hadn't, then modern-day gaming could look quite different than it does right now, since even the D-pad and L and R buttons were considered weird at one point. However, for all the gimmicks that Nintendo have churned out over the past few decades, I can't deny that some of them were completely stupid, so I totally understand why people roll their eyes at Nintendo whenever they come out with anything that isn't simple and straightforward. And with Nintendo having so many different gimmicks that are all hit and miss, I've decided to divide them all up into tiers in the hopes of saving at least one person from wasting their time on one of the garbage gimmicks that could have been better spent on one of the golden gimmicks. But even though I think just about anything can technically be considered a gimmick if you think about it, just keep in mind that I'm not going to be counting peripherals that only worked with one game like the Donkey Kong bongos, for instance, because if I did that, then we'd probably be here all day. So with all that being said, make sure to sit back in your least wet chair, press the subscribe button if you like games, goofs, and glory, and allow me, the Ayatollah of rock and roll, CameronAllOneWord, to guide you through the Nintendo gimmicks tier list, starting with the E tier, where everything just straight up sucks. The virtual reality on the Virtual Boy. Despite the fact that the Virtual Boy only played games in stereoscopic 3D, Nintendo seemed to get the chubs whenever they touted it as virtual reality, just because the console was hidden inside a pair of goggles. And you know, it really wouldn't be that big of a deal if that were the whole story behind it, but not only did Nintendo lie just so they could hang out with us, but if you actually play the Virtual Boy for more than like an hour straight, then there's a pretty good chance you're gonna get a migraine from the thing only playing games in red and black. And as if that wasn't bad enough, you're also gonna get neck pains for your trouble as well, since there's just no comfortable way to play this thing. So unlike all of Nintendo's other gimmicks, you can't even say that this one was harmless. And had the internet been around when this thing came out, then there would have probably been lawsuits out the ass, but since this came out in the 90s, the few of us who actually owned one just kind of walked it off and that was the end of it. The only two things about the Virtual Boy that kept me from making an F tier for this video, though, is that the controller's actually really comfortable, and the 3D effect does honestly look kind of cool if you only play the thing for like 2 minutes. Luckily for Nintendo, though, this is the only gimmick that I felt like they truly had that's worthy of being in the E tier, so let's move on to the D tier, where things may still suck, sure, but at least they don't give your ass a headache. Rob.
Hit up, Rob!
After the video game crash in 1983, retailers in North America didn't want anything to do with video games because they thought it was nothing more than a dead fad, so in order to pretty much trick stores into carrying the NES, Nintendo had to bundle them with a robotic operating buddy so the overall package would be more like a toy than a video game, and for good measure, they also gave it a shot in Japan with the Family Computer robot. The idea was for the robot to actually play games with you as a second player, which sounds awesome on paper, but as much as I love the history behind this thing, though, the execution was absolutely horrendous as you might expect from a commercial product from the mid-80s that was ambitious as this. And since it sucked noodles, Nintendo ended up canceling it before long, so as much as I love the history behind Rob, I can't in good conscience put him any higher than the D tier. Controllers with microphones. On paper, having a microphone on your controller or handheld that can be used to interact with games sounds really cool, but in execution, I can't think of one time where this wasn't a complete pain in the
Bunch of other junk. S-S-S-S-P-P-P-P. The end.
If I'm being honest, I've never actually used the microphone on the Famicom myself, but apparently you had to scream into it to kill certain enemies in The Legend of Zelda, which I'm sure parents were absolutely thrilled with in the 80s, and despite the DS coming out 19 years later, the returning microphone still sucked a big fat horse egg in 2004. I mean, it was kinda cool to be able to talk to people online without a headset, I guess, but the only times I've ever actually used this were all with strangers where I forgot to turn the microphone off, and this always led to extremely awkward conversations with strangers through Pokemon Heart Gold. You could also blow into the microphone to do things like refill your balloons in Mario Kart DS's Balloon Battle, although you could also refill the balloons by pressing a button, but if you did that, then the balloons wouldn't fill up as quickly, so the game definitely wanted you to get lightheaded. Then there were the god-awful flute sections and Spirit Tracks, where you had to make the song sound bad in order for the game to count your efforts, which would have completely ruined the entire game for me if I hadn't realized the trick behind it, and it's not a skill, by the way, it's definitely a trick. I'm sure there's plenty of other examples of Nintendo's in-game microphone mechanics being a butt wagon, but those are the only ones that I've ever had personal experience with. I mean, the microphone that came with the Mario Party games was kind of fun, I guess, but I don't know, I kind of consider that a separate peripheral. Labo. Nintendo Labo is a series of games that come with cardboard kits that you're supposed to use to build peripherals for the Switch's JoyCons to go inside it for some pretty unique experiences. The player could either drive in a cardboard vehicle, play in a VR headset since apparently Nintendo hadn't learned their lesson in 1995, or be a robot, or a monster. I'm not really sure.
It's either a robot or a monster.
When Labo was first announced, Nintendo's stock prices shot up by $1 billion overnight, which I'd imagine happened because investors probably thought this was just another one of Nintendo's wacky ideas that'd result in piles of money for everybody. And to be fair, some people were definitely excited at first, and some people even still love it to this day, which is why I got threats of bananas being shoved in my tailpipe for predicting that it'd flop. But as we all know, that's kind of more or less what ended up happening. I mean, I can't exactly say that Labo was that stupid, but it definitely came out decades too late, because most kids these days would either rather just play random mobile games, watch videos on their phones, and if they're gonna play video games, then more often than not, they're gonna be video games that are meant for adults. The initial hype behind Labo wasn't kids who were excited to play it, but rather adults who were excited for their own kids to play, because they really just wished that Labo existed when they themselves were kids.
Get your meat ass out here and have some fun with me.
Had this somehow come out in the 80s, 90s, or even in the 2000s, and it probably would have been a much bigger deal, but in 2018, meh, it was alright I guess, but with there being so much else to do, it just wasn't for everybody. Man, I don't know about you, but I certainly wouldn't want to clean this mess up for my stupid-ass kids after they were done watching me set it up for them.
I don't clean. I'm not clean. Okay? I don't clean. I'm not clean. Okay? You clean it up.
But anyway, let's keep things trucking with the C tier, where the gimmicks are admirable, but nothing that anybody ever really needed. The Wii Balance Board. As if it wasn't enough to have a remote for a controller, don't worry, we'll get to that, Nintendo decided to really double down with gimmicks on the Wii by coming out with the Balance Board that was mainly used for the Wii Fit series, but much to my surprise, there were actually over 100 other games that supported it as well, with one of them even being on the Wii U, oddly enough. Just like the name clearly implies, it's basically just a board that uses a controller by distributing your body weight in various ways to play games that involve fitness, skateboarding, and just whatever, really. At its core, it's really not all that much different from Labo, but seeing as how the Wii Balance Board works with way more games, most of which didn't have to be specifically made for it, and the fact that assembling it's not as much of a hassle that involves potential messes, I had to put it an ass hair higher than Labo. I mean, I might have zero desire to actually use this thing for myself, but I can still at least appreciate it for what it is. The Gamecube's lunchbox handle. Alright, some people might not consider this thing a gimmick, I guess, but I mean, come on, it's a friggin' home console with a handle. How else are you supposed to categorize this thing? I've always thought it was really odd that Nintendo felt the need to make this, since most people don't really move consoles around all that much, and even when they do, I don't think anybody's ever thought, man, I really wish there was a better way to carry this thing around. Especially for a console as light as the GameCube, but as weird and unnecessary as this is, I just can't bring myself to say that I hate it, and at the end of the day, we all do use it on those rare occasions that we find ourselves transporting a GameCube. The Wii U Gamepad. A lot of people blame the second screen touch control tablet for the Wii U's failures, but if you ask me, I think the real reason why the console failed is because the 3DS was cheaper, portable, had more games, and even though the graphics weren't as good, they were still completely acceptable. But still though, even though the Wii U Gamepad didn't necessarily kill the Wii U, the fact that most of the console's library doesn't even utilize it, it does make it a gimmick that Nintendo would have probably been better off without. The main reason why it's not lower on the list, though, is because, quite honestly, this thing's actually pretty comfortable to hold, and on the rare occasions where games actually do find a purpose for this thing, it really does enhance the experience like in Nintendo Land, which I'm still waiting to actually play with other human beings this day. And sure, it is much better to be able to bring the Switch with you anywhere in the world you want to go, but let's not forget that the Wii U paved the way for this thing by being the first home console that let you bring most of your games with you to the turlet, and that's all thanks to the gamepad. Still though, it really should have just been a high-end peripheral rather than a mandatory controller. And yeah, I know the gamepad wasn't always mandatory, but by the time Nintendo fixed it, it was definitely too little too late. The 3D on the 3DS. Alright, so the 3D on the Virtual Boy that Nintendo claimed was virtual reality sucked horse eggs and gave you brain damage, but the 3D on the 3DS is actually pretty impressive, and even more so on the newer models that track your face somehow so you could experience the effects without practicing your T-Rex survival techniques. But the drawback is that much like using your armpit to make fart sounds, the effect's only really cool for like 10 seconds, and then you only really want to experience it once in a blue moon from that point forward. And since nobody ever used the 3D, Nintendo said friggin' and replaced the 3DS with the 2DS so they could sell it for cheaper, which nobody seemed to even mind. But still though, it is still almost as cool as an armpit fart sound effect though, so if I put it any lower than the C tier, I probably wouldn't be able to sleep too well for at least a couple of weeks. Let's move on to the B tier though, where the gimmicks are actually starting to get pretty fun. The Nintendo Ereader. The Nintendo Ereader was an accessory for the Game Boy Advance that had you scan these little card things that were sold separately to add more content to certain games, so basically it was DLC without an internet connection. The content usually consisted of things like full NES games until Nintendo decided to start putting those on original cartridges, items or power-ups that were basically pay-to-win mechanics, and eventually full levels in the case of Super Mario Advance 4, which I always thought was the best part about this particular gimmick, but the reason why I didn't place it higher on the list, though, is because the whole thing's a pretty big hassle. I mean, first you obviously have to go out and buy the actual e-reader, but the problem with that is that it was designed for the original Game Boy Advance model, and it looks like complete ass on any other model. Then you gotta deal with all the link cables and buy all the cards you want to use, so before you know it, you're gonna find yourself divorced and in debt by the time you actually start to build a respectable collection up. And as cool as all the extra content may be, there's a good chance that you probably won't find it to be worth the hassle. Amiibo. These little collectible figures that came with microchips that could be scanned for extra content on the Wii U, new 3DS, and Switch are pretty much what the Nintendo e-reader would eventually become, except rather than the extra content being inside of the actual Amiibos themselves, they pretty much just unlock content that was already in the game, which might sound kinda lame, but the extra content's always something small like items or costumes, so personally, I don't really care at all that this content wasn't just included in the games from the get-go. And besides, unlike the Game Boy Advance that ran wild in much simpler times, putting any kind of substantial bonus data onto anything physical just isn't practical anymore in the modern day, since DLC is far more accessible than making people hunt figures down. I mean, I still think it'd be way cooler if Amiibos could be an option for real DLC beyond small cosmetic stuff that doesn't even matter, but even so, I still think it's a cool idea for Nintendo to make collectibles that do something more than just guard your video game collection. Just make sure not to step on them, you turkey. The Wii Remote and Nunchuck. The Wii Remote and Nunchuck were the main controllers used for the Wii, which utilize motion controls that typically required you to wave your arms around to play games, as well as pointer controls for games that involved any kind of aiming at all, at the expense of putting a sensor bar on your TV. The control method ended up being a massive success thanks to the casual market buying into the new and simplistic concept, but unfortunately, it gets kinda a lot of flack from traditional gamers who thought that these controllers were just not a good way to play normal games. And since I agree that using this gig to play something along the lines of a wrestling game, I couldn't place it any higher than the B tier, but with that being said, I don't think it's as bad for traditional games as everybody else does. In fact, at the risk of getting my booty hole rocked in the parking lot of Circuit City, I actually prefer pointer controls for aiming weapons in certain kinds of games like the Metroid Prime trilogy, and even for the Pikmin series for that matter. And as far as all the actual gimmick games are concerned though, you could really have a lot of fun with this controller setup if you don't think you're some kind of a tough guy who only plays big boy games where you go pew pew. And you know what, even if you do like going pew pew all the time, there's tons of really good on-rail shooters you can play with these controllers as well. But again, this controller setup really isn't ideal for most standard games thanks to the lack of a second analog stick, and honestly, the sensor bar is kind of a pain in the dupa. The Game Boy Advance Cartridge Slot on the Nintendo DS. As far as I'm concerned, this is probably Nintendo's most overlooked gimmick, but the original DS had a separate cartridge slot that was mainly used to play Game Boy Advance games, which I don't consider to be a gimmick in and of itself, but there were also certain DS games that used the second slot for things like the Rumble Pack cartridge, and if you had certain Game Boy Advance games inserted, you could also unlock content in a lot of DS games that were made by the same developers, most notably with the Pokemon series, where you could transfer older Pokemon into the newer games, and there were even certain Pokemon that could only be encountered if you had a certain Game Boy Advance version inserted into the slot. I guess that kinda makes his gimmick like the Amiibos and E-Reader, except rather than being a deliberately planned gimmick, it was accidental, but either way, I still think it was a really clever idea, and the only reason why it barely didn't make the A tier is partially because the gimmick was abandoned in the middle of the DS's life once the DSi models started coming out, but mainly due to the fact that I didn't want to crowd the higher tiers, since I think that tier lists should always be distributed somewhat evenly. But speaking of the higher tiers, let's move on to the A tier, where the gimmicks start to get a little bit spicy. The Nintendo 64's expansion pack. Alright, I know that most people probably wouldn't consider this to be a gimmick, but I can't think of any other consoles that let you upgrade this easily, and I thought it was an awesome alternative to buying an entirely new upgraded console just to play a handful of games like the Game Boy Color, new 3DS, and even 64DD did. I mean, imagine if all you had to do was change one little chip out to play big AAA third-party multiplats on the Switch, rather than having to play cloud games, slightly inferior, outdated, and more expensive ports, or even buying an upgraded Switch. Again, I know it's impossible, but a full-grown man can dream, damn it. The dual screens on the DS and 3DS. The Wii U Gamepad tried taking the concept of playing games on two separate screens to the next level, but in my opinion, the concept just works much better when both of the screens are next to each other rather than in two separate places. Again, sometimes the Wii U Gamepad actually made games a little bit better, but for the most part it was just overkill compared to the simplistic screens on the DS and 3DS that were usually only used for things like changing weapons in ass air faster and keeping maps handy. Obviously, there were games that were entirely built around touch controls, which I am considering to be a part of the same gimmick if you haven't noticed yet.
Kind of a package deal.
We sort of work as a team.
But even the touch control games felt practical way more often on the DS than they ever did on the Wii U. The 3DS's Street Pass. The 3DS was quite the hub for Nintendo gimmicks that didn't hinder your gaming experience, aside from the microphone of course, but thankfully most 3DS games never used that. However, out of all the 3DS gimmicks there were, the Street Pass is probably my favorite one, and it really grinds my poop that the Switch didn't keep it alive. The way it works is you bring your 3DS around with you in public, and if you go anywhere near other 3DSs, the consoles will do a quick data exchange wirelessly that consists of your Miis visiting each other's plazas, and if the users both have certain games, it unlocks bonus content within those games as well. There's also a good amount of games that were specifically made for Street Pass, where the only ways to make progress were either by meeting other users in the wild, or by spending coins that your console will collect every time you walk 100 footsteps. So even if you'll never cross paths with any other 3DSs in Frog Balls, Arkansas, you'd still at least be able to play these games somewhat. I'm sure most people probably never bothered using this feature, which is why it barely didn't make the S tier, but even though it did enhance certain games, it was never essential by any means, and if any jabronis at Nintendo are watching this right now, and I know for a fact that you are, then for the love of my best friend Shart, please bring this feature back, because I can't think of one good reason not to. But anyway, now it's finally time for the meat and potatoes in the S tier, where the gimmicks all live by the philosophy of no hesitation and no surrender. Rumble. Rumble's so common in video games these days that it's kinda hard to consider it a gimmick since, after all, I wouldn't really say the same thing about analog sticks, but since most games have this as an optional feature, I can't help but classify Rumble as a gimmick, especially with how it was introduced as a separate add-on that required batteries for the 64's controller. The JoyCons. Not only do these bad boys rumble, but somehow they managed to find a way to rumble in HD. It's kinda hard to explain what that means without actually putting Joy-Cons in your hands or butt, but it basically just rumbles in very detailed ways whenever games decide they want a little bit of extra feeling. But even beyond the HD rumble, the Joy-Cons have the most detailed gyro controls ever, and you can also detach them from the console for gimmick games, or even use them as two separate controllers for simpler games, while at the same time being joined together for traditional AAA multiplats, which is where the Wii Remote and Nunchuck failed miserably. I know these are technically multiple gimmicks all rolled into one, but what could I say?
Kind of a package deal.
We sort of work as a team.
You already said that joke, man.
Some people might understandably be sour over the high rate of Joy-Con drift issues, but assuming yours isn't botched, the Joy-Cons are essentially all of Nintendo's best controllers all combined into one, and they're great for standard games while also being the best controllers of all time when it comes to gimmicks, and even if they still somehow weren't gimmicky enough for you, you could combine them with other gimmicks to get even more gimmick for your gimmick, like the aforementioned Labo and Ring Fit, which, for the record, I'm not putting in this video since the Ring currently only works at that one title. But if you're watching this video from one of the possible features where they make more games for it, then, I don't know, throw it in the B tier, I guess. The only minor gripe I have with the Joy-Cons is that despite the gyro controls working really good for aiming without a sensor bar, I don't quite like it as much as the pointer controls on the Wii or even the Zapper. But speaking of the Zapper, though, well, the NES Zapper. Alright, so I know there were only like a handful of NES games that actually used this thing, and even though the Super Nintendo tried to recreate the magic with the Super Scope, the idea of a light gun never really caught fire again until the Wii Remote, kind of. But you know what, even non-gamers loved to play Duck Hunt back then, which is a lot more impressive in that era, and to this day, it's still one of the most memorable games on one of the most important consoles, and with the technology from 1985, it was pretty incredible that you could use a light gun as a controller to point at and shoot things inside of your TV. I mean, not really, but don't be a weenie, you know what I'm saying. And if it wasn't for this bad boy alongside Mario, then there's a pretty decent chance that video games would have taken a good bit longer to catch on in North America after the video game crash. The hybrid console. I'm sure some people are probably rolling their eyes at this one, but just because something's predictable or current doesn't mean that it's wrong. I mean, the idea of being able to play high-quality console games on your TV and then take them with you wherever you want is just plain awesome. Sure, some people might argue that calling it a high-quality home console is a bit of a stretch, and that a better description for it would be that it's a handheld console that you could hook up to your TV as opposed to the other way around, but honestly, I'm of the mindset that graphics reached the everything looks fine milestone back in like 2006, and that gameplay should always take precedent over visuals from this point forward. Obviously, I'm not trying to say that graphics on the PS5 or even the PS4 aren't noticeably different than the Switch. I'm just saying that even if the Switch were that powerful, I don't think games like Mario Odyssey or Breath of the Wild would really be that much better outside of the visuals. At least not enough to sacrifice the portability anyway, especially since there's so many good modern games that don't even utilize Sony or Microsoft's power anyway. But regardless of whether you classify the Switch as a home console that you could play on the go, or a handheld that you could play on your TV, it doesn't really matter though, because either way, it's still a pretty cool gimmick considering how quick and easy Nintendo made it. But anyway, that's my list. We've got the Virtual Boy all by itself in the E tier like the jabroni that it was, Rob, Microphones, and Labo stinking things up in the D tier, the Wii Balance Board, 3D on the 3DS, lunchbox handle in the Gamecube, and the Wii U Gamepad keeping things passable in the C tier. And then we've got the Ereader, Amiibos, the Game Boy Advance Cartridge Slot in the DS, and the Wii Remote and Nunchuck being sexy beasts in the B tier, the Nintendo 64 expansion pack, dual screens, and Street Pass raising all kinds of heck in the A tier. And then finally, we've got the Rumble Pack, Joy-Cons, NES Zapper, and the hybrid console concept in the S tier. I know there's probably some other Nintendo gimmicks or peripherals that I either didn't consider to be gimmicks, or I just straight up forgot about, so if there's anything important that you feel like I should have talked about, then feel free to berate me in the comments below, and as always, I'll try my goddamnedest to respond to everybody at some point. But if you liked this video, then you'll probably like this other tier list I made for every video game controller ever as well. But anyway, that's all for today, so I'm gonna go take a shit dump. Later.
So I want to say thank you to your loyalty. Thank you for your support.